Hello, everyone. Welcome to this very special Less Stress Parenting webinar today. We have one of my favorite groups and people here, and I'm really excited to share them and Alex in particular with you. We have a new partnership with Top Score Education. They are actually helping us provide the SAT and ACT prep in the whole DC metro area and outside of it virtually. We're joined today by Alex Chip, the founder of Top Score Education. And he brings with him over 20 years of experience in guiding students to excel on these critical exams. And having a daughter that's going through the ACT right now, because that's the one we decided that she would probably do best on, he's been personally helping her. And I can't tell you how amazing he has been. It's been such a pleasure. He's done wonderfully with her, and she's really performing in just a few months. So I'm really thrilled to have him here. He is known for his expertise and personal approach, very similarly to Illuminos. Alex and his team work directly with students to understand who they are, meet them where they're at, and customize their education process for these standardized tests for each student. And I think that's what makes them very, very special to work with. Alex has helped to date thousands and thousands of students to prep for this journey with confidence and come out great on the other side. There's little stress and a lot of confidence, which is really fabulous. As many of you have heard, there's big changes are coming to the ACT in 2025, and deciding between the SAT and the ACT can feel really overwhelming. Today, Alex will walk us through the updates about the new ACT, share some insights on the best test for each student and why, and discuss the ideal timeframes for test prep. He'll also offer valuable guidance for students with learning differences, including best practices for test prep and accommodations. I want you guys all to know that they also do provide high-level course tutoring, which can be really helpful for those of you who have students that are in AP or honors and or IB courses. They can help with those too, as well as those prep for the exams that go with those. So, we want to say a big thank you to Alex and his team behind the scenes for joining us today. And I'm going to turn it over to him to tell you all the good things he has to share. And at the end, you'll see how you can reach out to either of us for help and support. So we look forward to having you. Please do me a favor, put your questions in the chat box, and I will either let Alex know along the way if there's something that needs to be interrupted because it's a right there kind of thing, or more likely at the end, we will go through the questions one by one and make sure that your questions are answered. And so go ahead and keep posting those so that I can read through them as we get through the webinar, and we'll jump into the Q&A later. Thanks so much, and I'm happy to turn it over to Alex.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I really appreciate you having me here and for the warm introduction. I got into tutoring. I always wanted to be a teacher. I grew up here in DC, went to DC public schools, and then went to Landon School in Bethesda, eventually down to Duke in North Carolina. And when I came back, I knew I wanted to be a teacher. And I think I found my niche in the one-on-one tutoring versus the class role because I really wanted to be there as a supporter of the whole family and not just the student, and found that a lot of the joy that I've had in 20 years of teaching didn't necessarily come from the tests themselves, if you can believe it, but from those relationships that I built with the families and helping to counsel them through the decisions about when to take the test, how to take the test, which test to take, and then, of course, help their student try to succeed. And so every tutor that we've brought on to Top Score has to have that same philosophy, the idea that they're not coming in, they're not going to a learning center and just helping a student with their homework, but rather helping the student as a mentor and helping the family as an advisor and a counselor. And so that's really what we built the company on. And that's what today is about, is to try to lower the stress around the tests in general, but especially during a time of turmoil, because we've just gone through this whole test optional, or we're in the midst of test optional, test required. And then you changed the SAT last year. The new digital SAT debuted in the US in March of 2024. And now the ACT is changing. So as a parent, I can imagine you just sort of feel in this tornado of changes around the tests. And of course, the best thing that you can do to fight anxiety is to get information and feel your feet on the ground. And so that's what today is about. I'm not going to bore you with a million, details or minutia around the changes of the test. What I want to do is to provide you the really core things you need to know, and then provide a lot of Q&A time to answer any of your specific questions. So, today I want to make sure that I give you the what and the so what. So I want to provide a few of the big details about the changes, some ideas about when your student might prepare, how they make a decision, about SAT versus ACT, thinking about accommodations and how you get stronger on these exams. And so if you walk away with some questions answered and some new questions, then I'll have done my job, and I hope that that's sort of what we accomplished today. So to begin with a little bit of just the background, the SAT and the ACT overview, these are still tests taken primarily during junior year or senior year fall for college admission. That hasn't changed with all the things that have changed over the past few years. Today is not a presentation around what test optional is and what it means. That's a whole nother 40-minute conversation or more. But yes, some schools are moving back towards tests required. So pretty much everybody should be at least thinking about exams and whether their students are going to need to take the ACT or the SAT. Certainly, there are still hundreds of amazing universities that are test optional or test blind. So you may have a student who doesn't need to test at all in the end, but we are in a place where it's good to usually go through at least the first couple steps of thinking about the exams and whether they're a good option for your student. As far as the SAT, what it is now, it's a digital section adaptive exam that takes a little over 2 hours, whereas it used to take about an hour longer before they made the change last March. I won't go too much into section adaptive versus linear exam style, but I'm certainly happy to talk about that in the Q&A. The ACT, the current ACT is still on paper, about 3.5 hours. The new enhanced ACT will debut in spring of 2025, and I'm going to provide a lot of detail about that later in the presentation. Colleges accept the ACT or the SAT. They'll accept the current ACT. They'll accept the enhanced ACT. The universities do a very good job, and it's not very, very difficult to compare the exams, to compare exams when they change. The universities know how to do this. So there's never going to be admissions officers who say, I like this test better than the other. So you can just trust that if your student takes the test on which they'll score better comparatively, that's the better exam. You don't have to overthink it about which school might prefer a test. That's not something that you have to consider. So remove that from your stress bucket, please. As far as how to register for the tests, collegeboard.org and actstudent.org are the places to go. And they're also places where they're going to share resources, especially for free test preparation. Those are good places to find information versus just Googling things. Right there in the registration websites, they have that information. And the last thing on this slide is probably the most important, which is thinking about what does this test preparation process entail for my student. Taking the test 2 or 3 times is important. Students will build experience. They're going to benefit from super scoring, which I'm going to explain in the next slide. So you want for your student to plan to take the test a couple times. And when I say taking the test 2 or 3 times, I would advise taking the same test 2 or 3 times. So doing the work up front to determine for your student whether the SAT is the better exam for your student, or maybe the ACT is the better exam for your student, and forging ahead with that particular test over that 4 months or 5 months and taking that test 2 or 3 times versus maybe taking 2 or 3 SATs and 2 or 3 ACTs. To me, that splits the student's focus and is usually not as attractive an option either from a score standpoint or from a student stress standpoint to have to test so many times and sort of try to juggle so many different time limits, strategies, question styles. To me, it's much better to focus on one test or the other. And as far as picking a test, part of that is what we're discussing today. But beyond this presentation, of talking to your college counselor, calling into Top Score or another outfit like ours, or even doing research on the internet, it's usually not very difficult to find which test might be the better fit for your student and moving ahead with that one. As far as what super scoring means, because I mentioned that term before, and it impacts a lot about how we plan for a student's test preparation. The super scoring allows you to combine best scores across test dates. So I'm going to use this little graphic to explain this with the SAT. You have a student who, let's say, took the March test and got a 610 math, 710 verbal reading and writing for a composite score of 1320. Obviously, the reading and writing score was higher. So perhaps the student spends a little bit more time before their second attempt in May focused on the math. Maybe the first test they felt they underperformed a little bit, that they needed to work on their geometry. So they study that really hard, and maybe the reading and writing didn't get as much attention. And in the May exam, the reading and writing comes down a little bit, but you see that big jump in the math from a 610 to a 720. When they go to apply to colleges, they're going to be able to combine 720 math from May with the 710 reading and writing from March, and together have a stronger 1430 that was above either of their individual test attempts. And that's what the colleges are going to compare them against other students on, is that super score. Nearly all schools are going to super score the SAT. Many do the same thing for the ACT, not all, but most do the same thing for the ACT. A question I want to answer, which is then, should my student just take the test 6 times to improve the chance of getting one great math score and one great reading and writing score? I would advise against that for a couple of reasons. One being that that's a lot of stress to put a student through. Um, Additionally, both exams, SAT and ACT, have put a lot of research into this, and there is a point of diminishing returns where a student testing over and over again is not going to result in higher scores. And what it might result in is some schools do ask to see all of the tests that you took. And if you took the test 4 or 5 times, 6 times, versus a student who took the test once or twice, it might say something about the quality of your score or the quality of your test taking ability if it took you 6 times to achieve a certain score. It also might imply that you're focused on the wrong things rather than maybe spending more time in community service or leadership positions. You were taking the test 6 times to get 20 more points on your SAT score, which is not necessarily the best look for your application. As far as the preparing and testing timeline, the traditional old school preparation timeline was to take the test in spring of junior year, prepare over summer maybe, and take it in early fall of senior year. That was, for me, year 2000 at Landon, sort of how I approached it. But really today, students can test anytime during the year because the ACT and SAT are offered in every single month but January. So there's a lot of options. And I understand that definitely having all of the different options can actually create a little bit more anxiety for parents and families and students in figuring out what is the best plan for them. And frankly, that's why people like me exist, to help families make those decisions and make those decisions informed ones. But there is a lot more flexibility today, which ultimately is a really good thing. As far as when a student should test, it is going to depend on the student's individual context, but some of the considerations are the curriculum, especially in math. So the SAT goes through Algebra 2, whereas the ACT goes through a full year ahead of pre-calculus. So if a student is, let's say, taking Algebra 2 as a junior, the ACT is going to be a tough test for them because when they take the test, perhaps in winter of junior year or spring of junior year, they won't even have finished Algebra 2 and they won't have even started pre-calculus. And so that's a decent amount of the math that they won't be very familiar with. The pre-calculus on the ACT is around 15 to 20% of the math section, around 5% of the total score. So it's it shouldn't be the only factor, but it is a factor in your decision-making process. If your student is on track to do Algebra 2 as a sophomore, pre-calculus as a junior, it shouldn't really impact too much which exam you take. You should be able to take either one. You can take the ACT in fall or winter of junior year, even though that means you haven't completed pre-calculus. You can still take the test and not fear. You can learn the pieces that you haven't been exposed to in school yet. You can learn that through working with a tutor, working with a free resource like Khan Academy. So that doesn't need to stop you. But if you are taking Algebra 2 as a junior, that might give me some hesitation about taking the ACT as a junior. As far as the time consideration, when to do the preparation, and that's, of course, the question that I get the most often from parents and students. And really, it depends on when the student has the time and the motivation to do so. So think of test prep as a 4 to 6 month time commitment. It might take less, rarely would take more than that. And it might take more like 3 to 5 months. But if you can think about it on the longer side, think about it like a varsity sport or being part of a spring musical, something like that, to wrap your head around the kind of commitment that it might take if you want to do your absolute best. It's a good way to say, well, if I have 3 varsity sports during the school year, or if I'm in I'm in the spring musical, the fall play, and I'm in debate club every weekend, and I'm in 5 AP classes, that's a pretty tough school year. And so that kind of student might take example number 1 as a schedule, and they'd be on the very early side of preparing over the summer after sophomore year and try to get the testing done early in junior year by getting a lot of the work done over that summer. And that way avoid that crunch of having to, finish the school day, go to theater practice or football practice and come home exhausted at 6:30 or 7 and then have to do homework and ACT homework. That's pretty tough. So we generally try to help students decide what is the season that's going to be easiest for you to add on this test preparation to your schoolwork. Is it the winter season? Is it the spring season? Or again, if there are no great seasons, it might have to be that summer, either before junior year or after junior year. As you can see in example number 4, not everybody has to start early. If your student is really busy during the year and summer is a better time for them to prepare, but maybe they're not at the math or maybe the maturity level to do that preparation the summer after sophomore year, doing it in the summer after junior year is totally fine. And so that is a viable example as well. And I provided a few examples in between that give you a sense of when you might start, when you might test for the first time, when you might retest. And so those are 4 examples to consider. As far as the enhanced ACT, so this is the new ACT coming out in April of 2025. What they're doing is they're doing this sort of fade out, fade in. So for the months of the exam attempts in April 2025, June 2025, and July 2025, they're going to be doing this overlap where you can take the current ACT, which is on paper and a little over 3 hours, or you can take the new ACT, which is going to be provided digitally, and it's shorter, about 2 hours and 15 minutes, and the science is optional. And I'm going to go through some of these details in a few moments about what these changes are. But as far as the timing, it's being rolled out in that April 2025. So if your student, if the enhanced ACT sounds like a great option for your student, they'll be able to take that as soon as April 2025. Students sitting for that April, June, and July test, again, will have the option of either the current test or the new one. But starting in September 2025, that is the cutoff for when students will only be taking the new enhanced ACT, and that new enhanced ACT will be available digitally or on paper in that 2 hour and 15-minute format, and with the science test being optional. As far as those changes that I was discussing before, there are a lot of small changes, but I want to focus on the 4 biggest changes that are the most impactful for a student deciding whether this new enhanced ACT is going to be a good one for them. The first big one is the medium, is that as the SAT is digital right now, this enhanced ACT is going to be provided in digital form as well. And so in April, June, and July, the new enhanced ACT will be available only in digital form. And starting in September 2025, it will be available in the digital form or the paper form. And so that's going to be that's going to change, that you can take the ACT online. Not online, sorry, but on a computer. And that computer, you will be taking it in a test center. You won't be taking it on a laptop from home. Both the SAT and the ACT still require students to come into the classroom and take the exam there. The next big change is that it's going to be shorter. They've made it shorter in 2 significant ways. One is that they're making the science section optional. As you can imagine, this will make a lot of students happy. They don't have to take the science section. I do caution that we don't know yet how universities are going to respond to the science being optional. So universities that may require you, some universities may require you to take the science. Some specific degree paths at universities, think engineering or pre-med perhaps, might require you to take the science. Or all schools might require you to take the science, or none may require you to take the science. We don't know yet. That it's still this change is still very new. So universities have not really made known how they're going to assess this new enhanced ACT. So that is a big change, that the science will be optional for students to take, but optional will mean something different for different students depending on which colleges that they're applying to. I also mentioned that it's going to be shorter, not just because the science section might be left off entirely if you decide not to take it, but there are fewer questions in each subject. You can see, for instance, the current ACT, there's 75 English questions. The new ACT will have 50 English questions. The math going from 60 questions down to 45. So that will help some students who struggle a little bit with the longer format tests where they have to think about a lot of questions. They might prefer to focus on fewer questions, which brings me to the third big change, which will be that you have more time on average per question. So on the new enhanced ACT, there will be 10 seconds more per question on average. This is significant because in the past, you may have heard, if you've seen any of these webinars or read anything online about the differences between the ACT and the SAT. One of the big differences in the current ACT and SAT, and this has been true for 40 years, is that the ACT has always been a faster test. So the ACT was a difficult test for slower readers, even if they're very, very able, if they're just a little bit slower, more thoughtful about how they process information. That ACT could be a really hard exam. And the ACT has heard from their surveys, from talking to students, that students really prefer having more time for per question, even if the question is a little harder. And so that's what the ACT has done. They're providing more time per question in the new enhanced ACT. So students will be able to choose between the ACT and SAT and not have to do so solely on the basis of which test can I finish in time. So that is a really big change. And then the fourth change I wanted to mention is just that the reading passages, just like the SAT did last year in taking their long page-long reading passages and making them one paragraph long each, the ACT is taking their long 6 to 7 paragraph passages and shortening them. We don't know exactly how short they will be, whether they will all be one paragraph like the SAT, or if they may just be shorter, meaning anywhere between 1 and 3 paragraphs, but they will be shorter. So students who were not able to hold their attention over the course of a 6-paragraph essay or passage and answer a lot of questions about it will prefer this new enhanced ACT, just as many of them prefer the new digital SAT over the old one that did still have the longer passages. So there are other small changes in the new enhanced ACT, and I'm happy to talk more about some of the specific ones in the Q&A. But to me, those are the biggest ones that are going to impact a student's decision in terms of what test am I going to be really good at. As far as my ACT guidance, top scores ACT guidance for this year, it is a little bit tricky for this year's juniors. So I'm speaking to you parents who have juniors this year. It's going to be a little bit more complicated. That's the issue when you have more choices, is that it takes a little bit more legwork up front to figure out what is the best choice for your individual context. So there's going to be that overlap of the new and old test, which just gives you 2 different choices in April, June, and July for those ACT exams. And then starting September 2025, it becomes a little simpler because they'll move completely to their enhanced format. And so then your only decision for the ACT will be whether you want to do it on a screen or you want to do it on paper. I'm an old fogey, so I have my own particular point of view on which of those I like and which I like my students to prepare for, which is on paper. I tend to find that students who put the time into preparation, they engage better with material that's on paper that they can write in, that they can underline in, that they can circle, that they can highlight. Those are things that I find valuable during a preparation period that are kind of robbed of you with a digital exam. But that's kind of a discussion for another day. The new enhanced ACT, my bigger sort of issue with it for current juniors is that there's not going to be much practice material out for the new ACT. The first practice exam for the enhanced ACT is likely not going to be available until early January of 2025. So as a junior, if you're going to take the April or June enhanced ACT, you're not going to have a lot of opportunities to prepare for this new experience of taking this enhanced ACT online on the computer. The material, the content is going to stay fairly similar. The math question styles are going to be fairly similar. The English grammar rules that are tested are going to remain fairly similar. So there will be enough content to prepare for the content. But as far as the experience of taking the test, it's going to be, you're going in a little bit less with eyes a little bit more blind, let's say, taking the enhanced ACT if you're doing it in the spring of 2025, which is why, all things being equal, we will advise our top score students to likely choose between the SAT or the current ACT that's on pencil and paper for our current juniors. If you're a parent of a current sophomore, however, then that decision is going to be a little bit different because you're not going to have to make that choice between the current ACT and the new ACT. Because for you, starting in September 2025, your sole decision will be really between the SAT and the ACT. And for that decision, what we've always done at Top Score is encourage diagnostic testing, which we provide for all students free of charge. And schools also have practice tests, as you know, at your school, there's probably an ACT practice test day. So where you can get scores. Almost everybody takes the PSAT, which is a form of SAT diagnostic. And so you'll have scores to use to compare which test is the better fit for your student. And that's usually the first thing that we look at is how did the students score in diagnostic testing and what do the numbers say about which test might be better for which student? In the winter, spring of sophomore year is often a good time to do some of this diagnostic testing because it gives you a little bit of road ahead of you to make a decision about which exam is going to be better for your kid. Speaking of your kid, your diagnostic scores aren't the only thing that could determine which exam you take. Over the years, over 20 years of doing this and working with so many students, there have been certain characteristics of a student that I find do lend better to one test over the other. As you can imagine, the folks who make these two tests have slightly different philosophies about what shows college preparedness. And certain students are going to do better on one versus the other based on some of those innate characteristics. For me, my really strong ACT students have had something in common, which they tend to be hard workers. They tend to be organized. And why organized makes a difference is that the ACT test is based a little bit more on patterns. And so learning the patterns of the test requires understanding the organization of the test and those patterns. And so if you're an organized person by nature, that can lend well to your personal bent. STEM kids tend to do well on the ACT because the ACT tests math that's a little bit more advanced. And of course, it has a science section. So students who are strong in their STEM courses tend to have a little bit of a leg up on the ACT, and they lose a little bit of that advantage when they take the SAT. Time for extra time accommodations, which we're going to talk about a little bit later today. In the past, because the ACT has been such a fast-paced test, having extended time accommodations could be a great, I don't want to say an advantage because it's an accommodation to meet your need, but at the same time, a lot of students that extra time allows them to get their thoughts organized, to approach the test in a way that allows them to use the strategies, recognize those patterns. And on the SAT, that extended time doesn't necessarily help as much because having more time on a question that's a bit more based on, let's say, hard vocabulary words, that time is not going to help you to figure out, what a really hard word for you would mean. So the time on the ACT, if you get extended time, the ACT tends to be a better exam, at least in the current format. In the enhanced format, it remains to be seen. But as far as the way that the content is arranged, I would expect that to stay the case. From the SAT point of view, as far as what students tend to do really well on the SAT, I like my smart slackers. I love some of my students. They might not be super organized. They might not be super hard workers, but they're good. They have great logic. They're good readers. They're good test takers. And so sometimes those students can put in a little less work than my best ACT students, but still do really well on that SAT because the SAT is based a little bit more on what you can figure out from a paragraph. Do you have strong vocabulary? Can you hear what transition word best connects to ideas? Some of those things aren't based on learning 20 specific grammar rules. It might come from having read a million graphic novels and understanding how speech is put together. SAT can also be a good test for students who want to test early, but may not be very advanced in math, in which case it might be tough to take that ACT that has that pre-calculus component, but doing the SAT in that summer after sophomore year might be a little bit easier for them from a math standpoint because they don't have to go and do a bunch of independent study on the unit circle and sine and cosine graphs that are part of pre-calculus. And then kind of the rocking final exam versus quizzes every day. This is just a little bit of a mindset. Students who sort of do well, kind of walking into the test, cramming the night before, that's kind of an SAT skill to me. Whereas the ACT is better approached by somebody who's going to put in that consistent work over a long period of time to really build those patterns. So those are sort of just two, again, broad kind of stereotypes of my students who I've seen do well on the two different formats of the exam. And this slide wouldn't overcome for me, for instance, stronger diagnostic scores on one test or the other. but these are just the patterns that I've seen across my students over 20 years. As far as those accommodations that I mentioned before, the most common accommodations is the 50% extended time. The rest of these bullet points are different types of accommodations that you can receive for the SAT or the ACT. But the most common one that's provided by both exam folks is the 50% extended time for students. Again, as I've mentioned before, to me, the ACT is the test style that really takes better advantage of those accommodations if you get them for your student or if your student qualifies for them. As far as how to qualify, you generally want to start early in the process of making sure that you acquire those accommodations because it can be a process. Even though it's been streamlined in the last couple of years, it can be something that takes a little while, and so you want to start early. Fall of sophomore year is a great time to just start talking to your special education counselor at the school if you receive accommodations at the school. Say, what do I have to do in order to make sure I can confirm my SAT and ACT extra time accommodations for next year? Uh, you apply for I would apply for accommodations for both tests up front. Most of the paperwork is the same. It's not a lot of extra legwork to apply for both than for one, and you don't know a year down the road or 4 months down the road, which test might end up being the better one for your student. It's just generally safer to apply for both at the same time with the same paperwork. You're going to do that with guidance from your school's counseling team. When in doubt, ask your child's counselor. That's part of what they're there for, is to help support your student with things like this. They do it at school, and this is just an extension of that. You're going to have EdPsych testing, an official IEP, ILP 504 school documentation should be accessible. It should be up to date. So again, that's why starting early can be helpful. If anything, any of the documentation needs to be refreshed, you want to have time to do so. I do find that my score increases for my students are largest for students with accommodations taking the ACT. That's simply from a lot of data. Those are the students who achieve the greatest jump from where they start to where they finish. And I often find that those are the students who probably get the most out of the process outside of test scores, who learn about executive functioning. They learn about linear problem solving. They learn about organization. They learn about really being gritty and doing something over a long period of time. And for me, I've got a lot of love for my accommodation students because I've found that they, as I wrote here, they're just my most determined warriors in going to battle in this process. And I think that they do get a lot out of it at the end, a lot of confidence building from improving those scores. And because I often find that they improve them a lot. So I hope that you were able to take away some sort of core bullet points, from this discussion about the SAT and the ACT and the new ACT. There should be a lot of questions. I should probably have provoked more questions here than I answered because there's a lot going on with the change in the testing. But I hope that this is a good jumping off point for you to do your research, and hope that we can be really great partners for you in providing answers to some of your questions, and not just today. Our information is here. Please reach out to us at any time. You don't need to be a top score client to be a top score family. So I hope that you'll use us, leverage us for information from today moving forward.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was fabulous. Thanks for going into all the different deadlines and how to get signed up. Those were things that definitely caught me off guard when I was getting both of my kids actually signed up. And I'm happy to share that Alex has done wonders for my daughter, and I'm looking forward to him working with my son, and both have learning differences. So it's been a really wonderful journey to see how they've come along and moved through not being anxious about the test and knowing how to attack it through his work. So with that, I looking for questions. Does anybody have questions that they want to throw out there? I think that I have a few here. If I don't see anyone, other than there was a lot of questions about, is this being recorded? Yes, it's being recorded, and we will share the link with you next week once we have it uploaded, so that you can come back and take notes or share it with other people who need to have this information. Otherwise, let's see. Is there a way for families to determine if the ACT or SAT is a better fit for their students? How do you go about that? Is a little bit more
Sure.
of the information on that.
So absolutely the very first thing, it was I have kind of like a ranked list of the factors that I consider for most students. And the very first one is diagnostic testing. Because almost all schools offer the PSAT, you are getting an SAT style diagnostic score right there. And then taking a practice ACT, Many schools will offer one at some point during the year. Companies like mine offer them for free at all points during the year. It doesn't take much research. Well, it takes no research, just call us. But also other places like us do the same. And so getting an ACT score in a real test setting, and again, it won't be an official exam, so the score won't be on your record. It's just a practice exam under real proctored conditions. And then you can compare that against the PSAT. And then again, someone like me or your college counselor can help you to compare those scores and get a sense of which one is higher. If one of them is significantly higher and your student felt a lot more comfortable in that exam format, I think you have your decision right there. You don't have to overthink it. Oftentimes maybe they'll be pretty close, or your student might be split between the two as far as which one they feel more confident and comfortable with. And then it goes to some factors that are a little bit more subtle, such as which math class are they in as a junior. Like I mentioned, if you're going to be in Algebra 2 as a junior, SAT might be a better option. If you're in pre-calculus as a junior, or if you're advanced and you're in calculus as a junior, that ACT might indicate, oh, okay, well, there's some advanced math on this that you're going to shine on. So that might be something that's better for you. If you're not much of a reader, the SAT really requires strong reading skills on that reading and writing section. So that SAT might be better for stronger readers, for students who are good learners, but maybe not strong readers. That ACT might be a better exam because the reading style and grammar rules that are tested there are a little bit more formulaic and black and white, and a little bit less based on your intuitive reading skills. So I would rank them kind of by focusing on diagnostic testing scores, what math class you might be entering in, and then some of your reading and writing skills. But as far as how to help to balance and weigh those things, again, college counselor, someone like me, are probably the best people to go ask about which one might be better for your individual student.
The only other thing I want to add is that if you're really not sure and you have kids with learning differences, we do offer an assessment that looks at it's a scientifically based assessment where a student takes a series of puzzles over an hour, they complete it in an hour, and then it brings back a report that actually looks at how will they likely score. It's based on executive functioning skills. It's based on how they learn. It's based on how they take information, and how will they do on an SAT? How will they do on an ACT? And then what can you work on to get the best score, and which score, if one's test is preferable over another, it will say exactly why and what the steps are that are probably needed to get that score, whether it's using a calculator or having the ability to have extra time or those types of things. So we do have that available if anybody wants to do that before jumping in and just having kids take practice tests. That's something that we can do as well. But moving on from that, we have a question of what is a good PSAT score, which I've just learned more about recently. And what do you do if your child isn't able to take the PSAT in 10th grade as a practice and 11th grade as an actual, they haven't had a practice, they just take it in 11th grade and it is what it is. And can you talk a little bit about what is PSAT really for?
Sure. And so the first thing I'll say is that for the PSAT, there isn't really any reason to do as a sophomore if it's offered to you. I would take it as a sophomore. A lot of schools will make it optional for sophomores because they don't want to stress anybody out by making it mandatory. But again, to me, the more knowledge you have and information you have would be less stress. So I would advise taking it as a sophomore. I would not advise, and my nephew just took it as a sophomore, and he begged me to let him prepare, and I said, don't prepare. If anything, maybe understand the format so that you know what you're up against, the number of questions, but don't focus on the content. The whole point of the sophomore PSAT is to go in and see where you're naturally intuitively strong, where you're more naturally intuitively have growth areas so that going into a program or going into the SAT where where your growth areas are. You're not going to learn that if you do kind of a bunch of prep before a test that really doesn't matter outside of being a practice and being information for you personally. The junior year PSAT is going to be the one that if you score off the charts, you can possibly earn National Merit Scholarship. As far as like what kind of scores you need for that, they're really, really high. It's a very, very, very high bar to sort of meet that. And so that's where if you score very strong as a sophomore with no preparation, that might mean that you have the tools that with preparation, you might be able to sort of chase that national merit cutoff as a junior. But let me also say that that's a tiny percentage of the population. So as a parent or a student, that shouldn't be something that you are concerned about if you're sort of not in that camp when that PSAT scores come back. And as far as a good PSAT score, that's of course an incredibly kind of subjective word in terms of what is good for this student or that student. So, I think that the way that you can think about it is look at a PSAT score, again, with a great total grain of salt because the student, hasn't prepared for it. Know that they're going to raise their score from there if they do any kind of preparation, even if it's just individual preparation on their own. If they work hard, that score is going to go up. So look at the schools that they might be interested in. I would stay away from, don't look at Harvard's webpage. Look at other schools that are, really good, interesting schools. Look at what those scores are and look at where the PSAT scores are and how far away you are. And that will give you a sense of what is a good score for you. If your student, your student and how they're doing in school. And if they're not a student that from their grades is a student who's going to apply to UPenn, don't look at the UPenn SAT scores for admission and use that to judge whether your student's PSAT score was good or not. The national average is around 1050, changes each year, but between about 1,000 and 1050. So that will be, that's the national average. You can probably get the average from your school if you want to get a sense of where your student's PSAT score lies against their peers. And that to me is probably the best way to look at it or think about it because obviously, your GPA when you apply to colleges is going to be kind of compared against the GPAs of students at your same school taking your same courses, and your PSAT scores might be looked at kind of in the same vein. So that would be a way if you needed to kind of figure out what good means, look at the colleges, look at your high school.
Okay. Let's see here. What are some common pitfalls students encounter in preparing for the SAT or ACT, and how can they avoid them?
I'd say one pitfall, I mentioned it before. I don't love sort of going into this process saying I'm going to take the SAT a bunch of times and take the ACT a bunch of times and see where I'm better. I think to me that splits the student's focus in a way that's unnecessary and unhelpful. I think putting some time in at the beginning to figure out which is the better test for the student and then working forward with a plan. I think doing sort of scattershot, haphazard preparation is not the best way. I think that it doesn't necessarily need to be a huge ton of quantity of preparation for an exam, but having it be something that's structured and organized in a way that's going to work for the student is important. So I'd say the very first pitfall that a student's going to fall into is not having a plan for it. And then the second pitfall would be sort of not sort of planning for the second exam. So few students are with super scoring as an option. So few students are going to go in for their first test and get a score that they couldn't possibly improve upon. So if you are working to get the best score that you can, you want to at least have in mind that there's a good chance I might take the test again to see if I can improve at least one of my scores to improve my super score. And I think that sort of having that be part of the planning process helps the student to plan for that, have that in mind, and not feel like they take the first test and then 2 or 3 months later have to decide how am I going to move forward when some of the momentum might be lost from that.
Okay. Let's keep going here. So, in terms of, I have a child with a lot of anxiety, and adding studying for the ACT or SAT is overwhelming to them, given they expect to be studying in their junior year. And so, how do you help that with kids today? Everybody seems to have some level of anxiety going on, and the pressure obviously around the DC metro area is even more so because everybody kind of wants to get into the same schools, and the rumors are all that no one gets in unless you have perfect scores on everything, which we know isn't true. But
Right.
just wanted to throw that one out there because I think that's a good question that addresses a lot of kids today.
That's a great question. And so I think that we need to separate, let's talk about three buckets. Though of course there's 1,000 students and 1,000 buckets, but let's sort of look at three buckets in terms of anxiety and look at a normal amount, a kind of a healthy amount of anxiety, not necessarily healthy, but let's call it a standard amount of DC anxiety that like all of our students are going to have. But if they're going to go to fairly competitive schools and go into fairly competitive professional fields, there's going to be pressure to perform. So that's not something that I would necessarily, even as a kind of concerned helicopter parent myself, who's constantly in touch with each of my two kids, like, where are you emotionally today? That's me. That's the way that I sort of approach my own children. But at the same time, if their anxiety is at a point that's fairly similar to their peers, I would use this as an opportunity to overcome anxiety and to achieve something against the challenge of anxiety. Then, if you go up two buckets to where the anxiety is something that I heard the word overwhelming there, and that would concern me a little bit about tests. If the anxiety is going to be at such a level where it really impacts them psychologically, where it impacts how they're doing in school on their GPA, where it impacts how they're doing socially and their happiness when they wake up in the morning. If testing is at that level of anxiety, I would have a very hard time telling that student that they should be preparing for, working really hard for, and taking exams when there are so many fantastic test optional schools. So again, that's a hard, that it's a hard sort of meter to look at what is overwhelming anxiety and what is anxiety that's difficult to overcome. Overwhelming anxiety, I would say, as long as you don't have to go to this school X or school Y, schools up to the very best schools in the country, there are really test optional. And they don't just say test optional, they really are test optional. Awesome, outstanding options and choices. You are not limiting yourself really. There's 15, 20 schools that maybe you won't have the opportunity to apply to, but in the grand scheme, is that more important than having 6 months of terror for your student every day, right? So there's that bucket. And then the bucket in between, of course, is going to be the hardest one, where you're not sure it's overwhelming, where that anxiety is high. And I've had a lot of students with that. And not only did they overcome that, but then they were able to use the fact that they overcame it to help them in test settings at school and beyond in college. And again, eventually applying for, let's say, law school. There are many there. It's a lot harder at that graduate school level to get in without tests. So having gone through that process and overcome it made them more prepared to do it when the stakes were, if you can believe it, even higher for graduate school. So that's where certainly I would have difficulty telling an individual parent what I think about what that level is. You're going to have to figure that out for your own kid, but know that there is a point at which anybody in my position in the test prep industry would tell you, no, at that point, focus on school, focus on the things that they love in terms of activities, and find outstanding test optional or test blind schools that are going to be a great fit for the kid.
Thanks. That's a great answer. Another question that came up is AP exams. Are they like the SAT, ACT? Do you have to register by a certain date? What if a student isn't in an AP course? Are you able to work with them on the course material that will be tested on?
Yes, absolutely. So the AP exams, it's going to be very school dependent. So as far as like the registration process for your AP exam, if you're at a school where you're in an official AP class, a lot of times that will be done just straight through the school. They may even do it automatically for you. If you're at a school where they don't offer, let's say, AP US history, and you're just taking the US history course, but you're strong in US history as a student and you want to take the AP exam, you can usually sign up for it through the school, and they'll provide that information at certain intervals of the school year. But at the same time, whatever school that you're at, if you're going to take the AP exams, it's worth a call into the school to figure out what your school's process is for that and get it on your calendar. Don't depend on your school, especially if your school doesn't offer APs. A lot of schools now have moved away from AP classes, because not that they don't think the AP exam is good, it's because they don't want their school course to have to follow external guidelines. They want to teach the way they want to teach, which is great. And so the drawback to that, of course, is that makes it a little harder to score well on these AP exams, and it's a little bit more on the individual student. That's a big part of what we do in the spring, is help students who are either in AP classes, but they need a little more support, or who are not in AP classes, but they're strong in that subject and they want to take the AP. So we definitely help with that. We can also help advise students on which subjects are a little bit easier to prepare for outside of an AP class, which subjects are a little harder to do so when you're not taking it at school every single day. Those are the types of decisions that we can help you make. And then whatever tests you move forward with, we can certainly help on the preparation front.
That's great. I have one last question. What's the best routine for coming up on the Saturday exam? So I guess the ACT or the SAT, what do you tell your students to do, maybe starting Thursday, for a Saturday exam that's coming up?
Great question. And it will depend on the student. You have some students who are great crammers, and whatever they studied the night before, they remember all of it when they wake up. And then you have other students, and this has been proven through a lot of psychological studies, that the stuff you study and cram the night before, you don't actually retain it very well. So it does depend a little bit on the student, but my best generic advice that I would give to all my students, first and foremost, is to get a good night of sleep on Thursday night, because everybody thinks about the Friday night sleep, which of course makes sense. But the Thursday night sleep contributes to the sharpness on Saturday morning. So the Friday night is going to be the sort of more general kind of grogginess on Saturday morning. But in terms of like your sharpness on some little detail that you don't even recognize, it's the Thursday night. So a lot of students, I advise them to make sure they know what is due for school on Friday and try to do some of that earlier in the week so that Thursday night they're not up late doing schoolwork. And certainly I wouldn't give a student a lot of ACT preparation on Thursday night to make sure they get a good night's sleep that Thursday night. And then Friday, I usually some tutors say don't do anything ACT or SAT related on Friday, the day before the test. I tend to, for most of my students, I tend to think that it's helpful to do some pointed things, especially in an area where they have a little bit more retention weakness. Seeing some things one more time the day before the test, I think can be really helpful. And I have other students who may be a little bit higher anxiety, and I would say, you know what, you're going to be anxious enough for the test on Saturday, Friday. I want you to go out for a long run or a bike ride, get outside, get some fresh air, get your mind off of the test, get a good night's sleep, come in Saturday with confidence, ready to roll, and know that ultimately you can always retest, that no single test is the end all be all. Lower your stress level, try to breathe, and remember that everybody goes through it and everybody survives. And then just go and perform to the best of your ability and don't worry about what you can't do. Focus on what you can do and what you can control, and everything almost always will work out right in the end if you kind of follow those major tenets.
Thank you so much, Alex. I don't see any other questions. So I just wanted to say thank you for everybody attending. I'm glad you were able to make the time, and you will get the recorded version so you can go back and take some notes. I think Alex had some really important tips and information here. So if you missed something, you will be able to do that. So I want to say thank you so much to Alex and his team. Thank you, Alex, for sharing your valuable thoughts today. And you've obviously helped demystify the SAT and the ACT process and the changes that are coming, and what parents can expect, as well as really answer questions that I think that parents don't even know the questions to ask with respect to how do you figure out which route to go, and are there two routes, and how to set up for taking those tests, et cetera. So I think that was incredible, and I hope the parents really appreciated that too. And if you guys want to connect any further with TopScore, you can obviously connect with Alex directly through TopScore Education. I think it's topscoreedu.com,
.com.
topscoreedu.com. Or you can always reach out to us. You can book a call using the QR code on your screen, and we'll pass you over to Alex as well. Or if your child needs executive functioning support, or some college counseling, other things, just let us know. We're always happy to provide referrals to you. And like Alex said, you don't have to be a client of Illuminos or TopScore in order to be part of the family. We really love talking to families and parents and just helping them. It's kind of the core of what we do. So please feel free to reach out if you have any further questions in any areas, and we're always happy to give you some free guidance on that. And with that, I just want to say thanks so much, and I look forward to seeing you all at our next Let's Just Parenting webinar, which will not be until after the first of the year. So we will see you in 2025. Wow. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you guys all being here.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, everybody.
Take care. Bye.